We'll be talking through chapter 3 today, which is Landscape Heterogeneity and Dynamics. It is a monster chapter, and so we are tackling this sort of in a couple of different ways, and that will unfold as we make our way through the lecture. So what processes shape landscapes? We know that landscapes are by nature patchy. They are an assemblage of different habitat types, different systems. So there's really no other ecological construct quite as tied to the concept of heterogeneity as landscapes are. So it can be argued that heterogeneity really is the central concept in landscape ecology, and it's certainly one we'll return to over and over again throughout the semester. One of the definitions of landscapes is an area that is heterogeneous in at least one factor of interest. So heterogeneity defines landscapes. We're returning to that nice image that you guys have worked with already because it is, again, just such a clear depiction of the spatial and temporal relationship we see with elements within a forest ecosystem, in this case of boreal forests. So landscapes are characterized in terms of spatial and temporal heterogeneity, and it's important to understand the relationship between those, that oftentimes the largest spatial influences on a landscape also happen at the sort of longest interval on the temporal scale. And that's just a relationship that stands the test of time throughout all sorts of landscapes. So ecological systems have long been assumed to exist in sort of a balanced state, which are sustained by regulatory mechanisms that function to maintain the stability of that system. These stability concepts are laid out in a table in your book. I've got some of the stability concepts and definitions here for you to review. But it's just important to understand that traditional paradigm of ecology being a balance of nature and that enforces themes of order and stability and equilibrium have prevailed for a long time. But a lot of that, the book does a nice job of calling into question that prevailing theory and theme in ecology. But it is good to familiarize yourself with some of these concepts of resistance, resilience, persistence, variability, and constancy. So Alexander Humboldt was a pioneer ecologist and really one of the first to advocate for a quantitative approach to mapping and the study of vegetation. Others kind of carried the ball from where Humboldt started. A guy named Clinton Merriam developed this life zone concept, and that basically shows the general similarities in plant and animal communities that we see along elevation and latitudinal gradients. Leslie Holdridge in 1947 contributed further to that concept the role of bioclimatic information such as mean temperature, annual precipitation, evapotranspiration. Merriam defined 7 life zones, but those were expanded to over 30 different life zones with further research and work. And this concept, of course, assumes that these vegetative communities are both predictable and stable. This is the example from the book of holdridges, life zones in a diagram that gives that nice relationship between altitudinal belts, latitudinal belts, and humidity added to that matrix. So Frederick Clement in 1916 introduced the concept of ecological succession. This was presented as a directional, non-seasonal, cumulative change that we see in the types of plants and animal species that can occupy a given area through time. It involves processes of colonization, establishment, extinction, and all these act on participating plant and animal species as we see them transforming over time in a somewhat predictable, orderly way. So most successions contain a number of different stages that can be recognized by the collection of species that are present and dominant at that point of succession. Succession begins when an area is made partially or completely devoid of vegetation because of some disturbance mechanism. And then succession is thought to stop when species composition changes are no longer occurring with time. And that community is said to be in a state of climax, the climax community. So the concept sort of resonated with that balance of nature ideology. However, it was somewhat at odds with how communities actually appeared to be organized. We know that vegetative communities really exhibited far more variability than was suggested by the original concept of this. So Gleason built on this concept and viewed plant communities as highly variable, and that this variability was attributable to forces of dispersal and time and intrinsic heterogeneity in the physical environment. So by the 1970s and 80s, there was really kind of growing consensus that the disturbance act on communities at a variety of spatial and temporal scales, and that further, the effective disturbance is not always 100% present and does not happen kind of on 100% of a community. So lots of disturbances only remove part of a previous plant community, and that was really the beginning of our understanding of patch dynamics within a system. But just to give you a frame of reference, if you didn't already have one, this figure sketches out succession of an abandoned old field, so a place that was once in agriculture, left fallow, and how we would expect for that habitat, really the annual disturbance of human planting being removed from the landscape, and the succession of plant communities that we would expect to see and the timeline on which we would see those. So I will not talk through all of these stages of succession from old field to oak forest, but read through those on your own time. The figure here, 3.4, captures the concept of shifting patch mosaics and steady state. And what this presents is that there can be a balance between disturbance on a landscape, the scale, both temporal and spatial, at which we anticipate to see certain types of disturbances, and that those can give rise to a shifting mosaic of habitat patches that maintain a relatively consistent proportion of a landscape. So landscapes can be viewed as a mosaic of successional patches at various sizes, whose diversity depends partially upon patch dynamics. And if that rate at which disturbances occur is offset by successional changes in previously disturbed patches. Then the portion of each landscape within each successional stage should remain fairly constant. The book gave a really great example of Huffaker's experimental design and patch dynamics. It was a predator-prey experiment conducted in 1956, and really a classic experiment on patches and predator-prey dynamics. What Huffaker did was created a patchy model landscape with oranges and balls, and in using spotted mites, which served as prey, and then a community of predatory mites, he was able to demonstrate that by altering the availability and spacing of oranges, that there was a profound effect of heterogeneity that the patch dynamics can have on that predator-prey relationship. So only when creating a spatial environment where prey were given the dispersal advantage did predators and prey find a balance and were able to coexist. In many configurations of his experiment, the predators actually drove their prey to extinction, and then they themselves collapsed as well. So a really kind of elegant design to demonstrate a landscape ecology theory. A little more on patch theory and ecology. The hand drawings of John Cuttis's showing the transition of a forested and unsettled township into a patchwork of forest fragments is actually one of the most replicated images in ecology and in landscape ecology. This was actually the same diagram was used by MacArthur and Wilson to demonstrate how the theory of island biogeography can also relate to habitat patches within a landscape. So today we have spatially explicit models, of course, that consider the location and other spatial attributes of patches that have been really indispensable to developing ecological theory. So we already talked through the theory of island biogeography, but this chapter revisits MacArthur and Wilson's theory, which again can be extrapolated to consider patch dynamics on mainlands and the relationship of distance of variously sized patches and what we might anticipate as far as extinction and colonization rates go on that patchwork as well. So revisit this this theory in the context of landscape heterogeneity. It's also important just to get some terminology down at this stage. So we've talked about patches. I think it's fairly intuitive when we look at that landscape configuration of forest patches or fragments left over after 50 years of harvest and occupation by humans, what the patch is in that landscape. So here we see a diagram that shows us what the where the patches are in this landscape. The matrix is that area between the patches. So it's the dominant component of a landscape in that altered forest fragment diagram. Perhaps the matrix was agricultural land with dotted patches of forest interspersed. But this shows you that concept of being able to define both the matrix the patches, and then in some cases we might have corridors that connect our patches. We've talked through source sink dynamics and the concept of metapopulations already in the last lecture, but because this chapter revisits that concept, I think it's good to reinforce how that relates to patch networks. You know, since quality of habitat is likely to vary among patches of habitat, it's really important to consider how low quality patches might affect population. Source habitats, source patches, are those that are high quality enough that on average allows a population to increase and thereby would have more emigration than immigration into the patch. It's going to be a source where individuals leave that patch because of heavy competition, because of the high quality, and move perhaps to lower quality or to colonizing new areas not previously occupied. Sink habitat is a low quality habitat that would not be able necessarily to support a healthy population, and any excess that produced in the source frequently moves to the sink, and then that population doesn't tend to persist. And so this is a theory that has been well studied, and you might actually think about how we can recognize on the landscape, based on the relationship of area of these forest fragments, which ones may be sources and which ones may be sinks based solely on their spatial shape. Just to revisit the concept of metapopulation dynamics, we know that as we transform large expanses of relatively uniform habitat patches of the landscape matrix, physical changes occur that create island effects in the resulting fragments. And so those changes tend to be a decrease in the patch size, an increase in the proportion of edge within each patch, which in turn causes changes in microclimates within that patch. There's increased sunlight that's going to affect plant communities, particularly around the edges, greater fluctuations in temperature, and greater exposure to wind. So a habitat patch, again, is just a discrete area used by a species for breeding or obtaining resources. They have a definite shape and spatial configuration. Mosaics are patterns within the landscape that are composed of smaller elements, such as individual forest stands, shrublands. They would include highways and rivers, farms and towns. And I want to make sure we talk explicitly about this concept of edge effect between patches, the interface between a patch and perhaps the matrix. The higher the interior to edge ratio that we have within a patch, the less patched border you have, which decreases the amount of interaction with the surrounding matrix. A higher interior to edge ratio also decreases the probability of barriers that could limit the movement of organisms, decreases the probability of habitat diversity within the patch, which would not necessarily be harmful because it would be natural, decreases the importance of corridors for species movement as they're able to move more freely throughout the matrix, and increases species diversity in the total number of animals within the patch. So the book takes a good bit of time discussing river landscapes in general. I pulled this image out of the Black River mapping tool that I've already shared with you guys, and it gives us a nice sense of the area around the river that is within the floodplain, the area that is influenced by the river and the habitat is defined by its proximity to the river as palestrine. So river corridors consist of a really dynamic mosaic of spatial elements and ecological processes arrayed hierarchically. And in that way, they really fit comfortably into the framework of landscape ecology. This concept of applying landscape ecology theories to rivers really led to the discipline of limnology, which is the spatially explicit study of lakes, streams, wetlands, and how they interact with freshwater, terrestrial, and in the human landscape. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive into landscape diversity of the Black River area and give some descriptions of some of those community types and the influences, the heterogeneity in that landscape that influences that. So the natural plant communities that we see within the Black River include bald cypress, Tupelo gum swamp. That habitat type is one that is closer to the coast and influenced daily by tidal inundation, so flooded twice a day. And there's a unique community type that can persist with that sort of soil saturation. You see in this picture the bald cypress trees and their knees, which are presumed to be a soil stabilization feature, upshoots from the roots that create a network around the tree and literally hold hands with other cypress trees in that area and allow them to grow tall and large in these wet soils. Bottom hardwood forests are also wetland forests along the river, but further up where the tidal influence is, where we don't see the tidal influence anymore. So these are wetland forests that are adapted to being seasonally flooded, not flooded daily. Embedded within these systems, we see floating log communities. Even these cypress knees can have their own community of plants persisting almost as small islands with herbaceous plants and mosses that can grow there and disperse to other floating logs and islands within that wet system. As we move into the upland areas, we see longleaf pine forests, pine flatwoods. Embedded in those, we see depression meadows, places again that are wet enough to persist with wet soils, plants that could persist with wet soils. We see levee forests right along the river itself in the bottomland hardwood area. So a slight rise right beside the river, a natural levee formed by the flood regime there that allows accretion of soil over time. We see mixed hardwood forest, particularly right at the edge of the forested wetlands and that upland pine community. We'll see what we call fringe hardwood forest, and then the unique community of shoals and streams, stream bars right along the river itself. So all of this, all of these plant communities are generated just by the highly complex geologic history of the river itself. And it really is an incredible habitat to explore. Wish we were able to do a field trip. Trying to think if there's any more I wanted to tell you guys. All right, that'll be it. So we've covered this a good bit, just the concept of diversity that we see across space and time and different processes within ecosystems, and the fact that there's generally a relationship between the size of a disturbance and the frequency with which we see that disturbance. So spatial heterogeneity includes measures of landscape diversity, variety of land cover types, and their relative abundance. Spatial variability is a statistical concept that examines the degree to which locations are related. We expect to see an increase in variability with an increase in distance between patches. Some of those same concepts apply to temporal heterogeneity, patterns that occur in a time-date series. Temporal heterogeneity can be measured in terms of temporal dependence as well. So measurements closer in time are more likely to be similar than measurements that are further apart. So some of the things we'll consider with temporal heterogeneity are whether or not we see a positive correlation as with an earthquake. An earthquake is more likely to be within a close temporal time to another earthquake or tremor. And we see negative correlations as well, such as with a fire event, where once you've had a fire event, it is less likely, because fuel loads have been reduced, that you will have another fire event in close temporal proximity to that one. All right, guys, so the book outlines, let's see, in table 3.2, some of the disturbance concepts. I want you guys to spend some time with these. This will be part of your assignment for this week, thinking through different measures of disturbance and how we describe a disturbance within a landscape. So I captured just a few of them here and will not read them to you, but frequency, return interval, disturbance rate, disturbance size, and then concepts such as the intensity, severity, and duration of a disturbance are all important in considering the spatial and temporal impacts of a disturbance in a system. The concept of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis is described here. So Connell in '78 said that organisms tend to be killed or badly damaged in all communities by disturbances that happen at various scales of frequency and intensity. Trees are killed or broken in tropical rainforests by windstorms, landslides, lightning, insects, so on. This hypothesis suggests that the highest diversity is maintained at intermediate scales of disturbance. And this is a ecological theory and a tenet of landscape ecology that's held true over the years. The book gets into a discussion about large and frequent disturbances that we see on the landscape: floods, wildfires, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, severe hurricanes. And because of the magnitude of these, it can result in really a complete reorganization of an ecosystem over time. There might have been a time that we just looked at these large and frequent disturbances as rare events, but what we know now is that they are really part of the normal dynamics of many systems. We tend to measure these, as I'm sure you guys are well aware, with terms of 100-year floods, 1,000-year floods. We measure these in the perceived impact of them within really human lifespans. The book moves into some discussion on the concept of landforms, and I've got a few slides here that are a nice depiction of landform diversity, variety that we might see within a landscape, and how different soil types and moisture levels really define the diversity within the landscape and the types of communities that we see there. So We know that landforms are created by tectonic movement, volcanic eruptions, glacial expansion and retreat, movement of sediment and water and erosion. And the book goes into a good bit of detail on all those geomorphological processes, but I think we could just suffice to acknowledge that that we're aware that these forces exist and that those very long range geologic processes have a profound impact on the diversity that we see in a given place at a given time. So your book goes into some detail about the formation and diversity of different soil types. And I think we can suffice to say that there's a remarkable range of soil types that results from just an infinite variation in geology, climate, vegetation, topography, and how long areas have been exposed to those forces. But the foundation of diversity in a landscape is based on the geologic diversity and the landform diversity that we looked at in the prior slide. I had this slide from something that we'll revisit in this class, which is the Nature Conservancy's analysis of terrestrial resilience. And it's based on the premise that that diversity in the future will be defined, as it always has been defined, by this geologic diversity and soil diversity that we see in the landscape, and that it's important to conserve the stage, and that with climate change we expect that the actors will shift and change, that we'll see community types shifting with climatic variables, but that preserving a diversity of soil types and different landform types will in fact allow for a template for that to happen. But what we know, and when we look at the conserved lands out there, is that we do not have equal representation across different soil types and landform types. And this figure captures that concept that fertile, productive, moderate environments, such as limestone soils, low elevation areas, fine sediments, gentle hills and valleys, are underrepresented in the conserved lands portfolio, and that we actually see those areas more intensely developed or committed to agriculture. So the development and the agriculture areas are in black and gray. Conserved areas are in shades of green here. As we move into landforms that are steeper and harsher, more acidic soils, settings that are difficult for people to access, we see a higher proportion of those in the protected lands portfolio. So just an interesting comment, an interesting problem to sort of reflect on as we think about what our priorities should be for protecting lands in the future. The book goes into quite a few of the concepts of heterogeneity in the landscape, including disturbances and the contributions of humans to that disturbance. And so we know that habitat loss, human-driven habitat loss, is really the greatest form of disturbance on our landscapes. Its loss is defined by complete change in the community and in ecosystem states. And we see losses at all levels of biodiversity. At least 60% of the Earth's ecosystems have been degraded, but temperate grasslands, savannas, and shrublands have lost even a greater proportion because of their importance for agriculture. And then we can kind of grade habitat loss into other definitions that we will use in landscape ecology, such as habitat degradation, transformation or conversion. That refers to the complete change of a habitat. Habitat fragmentation, like the fragmented forest slide that we looked at, is an increase in edge habitat and a loss of core forest areas. And then also within the landscape, we can talk about features that include human created features that have an impact on species that live there. These might include cell towers, wind turbines, and in particular, the fragmenting feature of roads and highways of all different sizes. And there's quite a bit of effort that's gone into studying road ecology and to understand how roads function as barriers for species and hinder gene flow across the landscape. This is just a glimpse at some of those studies. A group called the Wildlands Network did a pretty detailed study just in North Carolina looking at the 4 million miles of roads and building the case for underpasses and overpasses to help foster movement across these barriers in the landscape. Part of the case for connectivity with the fragmenting features of roads is that in this state alone, they see about 61,000 wildlife vehicle crashes. This data came from just a 2-year time span. There were 20 human fatalities, over 3,000 injuries, and millions, almost 150 million in damages just in a 2-year time frame. So wildlife underpasses and overpasses can reduce wildlife vehicle collisions by 80 to 90%. They essentially pay for themselves. And as we know, they can also help restore connectivity, reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, and improve public safety. The Wildlands Network study goes on to identify those places that might be most ideal for underpasses or overpasses. It looks at habitat features, core habitat areas, protected areas, and it's really an elegant analysis of where we might prioritize this sort of investment in the future. So I will have this assignment up on its own page, but the book, really went into a lot of detail with a variety of case studies on different types of disturbances. And rather than trying to capture some of that in a very long lecture, I was thinking I'll have you guys create presentations, sign up for some of these case studies. There are not 12, and so a few of you guys can pick your own disturbance to study and present that to the class. Your discussion assignment for the week will be to comment on your fellow students' case studies. Again, go back to that table 3.2 and look at some of those parameters of disturbance, making sure to incorporate that language into your summary of your disturbance.